It is my great pleasure to introduce to everyone Dr. Gerry Altmann, who is with us today virtually from the University of Connecticut. Gerry was born in Oxford in the UK, and he got his first degree from the Laboratory of Experimental Psychology at the University of Sussex, followed by a PhD at the University of Edinburgh in artificial intelligence, investigating broadly theoretical and behavioral approaches to human sentence processing and the influence of context on syntactic ambiguity resolution. Gerry started his career at the University of York, where he investigated the influence of language on visual attention, and also the relationship between the comprehension of visual scenes on language comprehension, providing really foundational research on the neurocognitive underpinnings of language processing. In 2014, Gerry moved to the University of Connecticut in the United States, where he heads now the Connecticut Institute for the Brain and Cognitive Sciences. Gerry is an incredibly prolific researcher who has marked the field with key scientific research on event cognition from behavioral, neuroscientific, and computational perspectives. Gerry has also edited 5 books, and his authored book, The Ascent of Babel, was awarded also the British Psychological Society Book Prize. He, among other things, was the honorary secretary of the UK's Experimental Psychology Society and the editor-in-chief of the journal Cognition for many years. Most of everything, beyond his academic achievements, which are amazing, Gerry is a wonderful mentor and an academic at large. Many years ago, when I was relatively younger than today, I reviewed a manuscript for Cognition when Gerry was the editor-in-chief. Back then, I did not know Gerry in person. The manuscript was rejected with consensus from everyone, but Gerry sent an amazing, wonderful rejection letter to the authors. And that letter reinfused a sense of trust in the system in myself. And I felt the urge to write him a thank you note for being so humane. I still keep that email to this day. Fun facts about Gerry. Gerry spent many summers in Italy through his life, so he understands Italian, and I need to be careful now not to say funny things about him in Italian because he understands. And he's one of the only few psychologists, living psychologists, whose portrait is at the permanent collection of the National Portrait Gallery in London. And this is the portrait. So if you go to the National Gallery in London, you will see Gerry Altmann portrayed there, which I find amazing. But without further ado, thank you, Gerry, for being with us today during these really incredible times. Today, Gerry will talk to us about finding event structure in time, theoretical, behavioral, and computational perspectives. Please join me in welcoming Gerry, who's here with us. Thank you, Gerry.
Oh, thank you.
And stop sharing. And
yeah, I haven't seen that picture for a long time. So I'm going to just share my screen. What I'm going to do is I pre-recorded the talk, but I should warn you that a funny thing happens to me when I'm in front of Zoom. I become like one of these old-fashioned presenters that we had in England, doing an Open University program. So the Open University is all about distance learning. And these people would speak in this very stiff, deliberate British manner. And normally when I talk in front of an audience, you know, blah, 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 but in front of Zoom, it just comes out as horrible. So I apologize for that. And I'll describe at the very beginning how the talk's going to work. There's going to be some breaks, sadly no refreshments. But I just wanted to comment one thing on Eleonora's very gracious introduction. You know, it's lovely to be thought of as you know, having marked the field, but I have to say that I took my dog out this morning for a walk and she marked the field too. And I hope that the way in which I marked the field was somehow different. Okay, let's see if I can share my screen. in just a moment. Here we go. Okay, so let me just move us to a bit where you can then see what's going to happen. For some reason or other, my computer has slowed right down. I'm just going to check to see what's going on in the background. Nothing that I can see. So I hope this works. For those of you that have put this in full screen view, if you go to the top right and go into the standard view rather than either of the views that have the people in the right-hand side, then it will go even bigger to fill the whole screen, the movie, and it won't be too blurry. So let's hope this works. I'm going to be talking about today some work that I've been doing over the past decade or so with a number of people, two students of mine at UConn, Zach Ekvies and Janina Pristauka, Forrest Davis, who's a computational wizard at Cornell, and then Nick Hindi, Sarah Solomon, and Sharon Thompson-Schill, with whom I first embarked on human neuroimaging. We're all interested in event structure and specifically how it is that we encode the content of events. And I'm going to divide the talk into three parts. First, I'll start with some theory, then I'll talk about some relevant behavioral work, including some neuroimaging, and then I'll end with a computational perspective using recurrent neural networks to model some of the phenomena I'll be talking about. At the end of each of these three sections, I'll be stopping and inviting questions. So we all have a pretty good idea of what we mean by an event, but I want to be very clear about what I shall be meaning by that term. And for me, an event happens if something changes state over time. So here's an example of a typical event. We have our chef, Gordon Ramsay, chopping an onion, and the onion is changing state from intact to chopped. And the question we have is, how do we encode the representation of such events? And how do we do that whether we're observing an event, as we did when watching this little movie, or when we read or hear a description of such an event, such as this one at the bottom here, the chef chopped the onion. Now, if we had tracked the entire event, we would have noticed that the onion started off intact, then it was peeled, then perhaps it was halved, and then one half was chopped. So we need to, in order to encode the event, we need to track this particular instance of an onion across time. But we have to do more than that, because in this case, for example, we have to somehow encode that the two onions that are encircled at the top here, the intact one and the peeled one, are in fact different instances of onions than the one that was actually chopped. So we have to distinguish between different instances and track individual instances. So why care about representing this kind of change? Why care about tracking tokens and distinguishing between different instances of things? Well, for me, cognition is about the ability to internally represent the external world. So that means the ability to encode types of things, onions, oranges, chairs, but also to instantiate the actual things, the tokens that I actually encounter in the external world. It's an ability, by the way, shared with slime molds, that is, encoding, representing, anticipating, causing, and acting on change. And I can come back to that in questions if you're curious about slime mold. Okay, let me start then with the underlying theory that we're adopting for this journey. So I mentioned when we were viewing this that there was onions, there's a chef, the onion is changing state. There's a lot going on. So we can think of events as ensembles of representations, some collection of that whole lot of stuff that is happening. But what are these ensembles of representations? What are they representations of? Well, individuated objects, that is tokens, their histories, and I shall come back to that in a moment, and the relationship between one token's history and another token's history. Now, by history, I really just mean that tracking of the object across time as it changes state. And in this little cartoon, I'm depicting that in the following way. I'm assuming that I have a representation of an object in some semantic space that represents its features across time. And that object undergoes some change in those features through time, and we can think of that as a trajectory. Of course, a trajectory doesn't finish with the chopped onion. Other stuff happens later. Now, in the case of the movie that we watched, there's also a knife that comes in and intersects both figuratively and literally with the onion. And there is also the chef, Gordon, who picks up the knife and then attacks the onion and then presumably puts the knife down and goes off on his the rest of his life. So this is what we mean by an event being a collection of intersecting object histories. Now, you don't have to have more than one object for an event to take place. It could just change state without any such interactions. But there could be such interactions, and this is what they would look like in the state space. Now, importantly, we're not representing action explicitly here. And that's because really there are no actions. All there are small changes in the spatiotemporal characteristics of the objects in our environment. So here I've shown each individual frame as it unfolds. There's just a knife getting closer, and there's a chef bending over, and the onion starts to cleave and separate into distinct pieces. So on this account, we view action as an emergent representation. So representation abstracted across those intersections of object history. So what's the theoretical challenge of trying to represent object tokens? Well, one challenge is, how do we build these representations on the fly? How is it that we each now have a representation of the onion that Gordon Ramsay was chopping in that video? Now there we directly apprehended the onion using our visual senses, but we don't have to use vision in order to build an event representation. I can just use language. I can tell you about my dad's hat. It's one of those Cossack hats that's sort of triangular shaped and a sort of curly, wiry wool. And there's a whole story to this hat that I shall leave to another time. But we each now have some representation of this specific hat. So the question then is, how do we do this? And I'm going to just take a step back and point out that normally when we think about meaning, we attribute meaning on the basis of systematic associations across our experience. This is a standard approach from within the field of semantic memory. What Zach Eckfees and I claim is that we generate token representations on the basis of the non-systematic associations across our experience. And I'm just going to illustrate that now with this picture of Gordon Ramsay chopping parsley. And the question will be, how do we generate a token representation on the fly for this parsley? Well, the first thing we do is we apprehend through the senses the green stuff in front of us, and we just associate that with the other stuff in front of us in the environment. So these yellow arrows are meant to represent these random associations. But seeing that green stuff also activates in semantic memory some representation that we have generated across our experience of parsley. And so we activate that representation. And now that becomes an activated, if you like, entity within our representational space. And so that also becomes associated with the other stuff in our concurrent environment. Now, not everything is sort of random association. There are some systematic associations. So, for example, our semantic memory of parsley might tell us that usually parsley occurs in our experience on a chopping block, and there is a chopping block. So we have that association, but it is more systematic. But there are also conjunctive associations which will activate entire schema. These are representations of situations. For example, a representation of a kitchen, what kind of things we find in a kitchen, what kind of other events might occur in a kitchen. So we activate the schema, and this complex representation again is associated with the other things in the environment. So what we see here is that the parsley has a very complex representational signature that makes it unique across time relative to any other parsley that we have encountered in that time. Now, of course, we don't just see individual snapshots, individual photographs of things. We tend to experience events as unfolding through time. And as it unfolds, it's not that we forget the previous moment in time, rather there is an echo. So in this portrayal here, we see that echo. So this actually gives us a very important opportunity. So at each moment in time, we can create these associations between the different objects in our environment. At the next moment in time, we do the same thing, but because we still have that echo from the earlier moment in time, we can now associate things at the current moment with things in the previous moment. And we can do this throughout the unfolding of the event. And we're supposing here a recurrent architecture, that is one where we have access to a fading memory of the past whilst we're experiencing the present. And we're doing that in service of a system, we suppose, that is trying at each moment in time to predict what the world will look like at the next moment in time. I'm going to come back to this when we describe some of the computational work that we've been doing. So this process of sort of randomly associating everything with everything else in the environment is called relational binding. It has a very established history in neuroscience, tracing its origins to Cohen and Eichenbaum's work. It allows one to bind each representation to its context and to bind each representation through time, modulated by things like saliency, attention, and semantic memory. The question, though, is how do we do this when we just experience the language? Well, it's actually a very, very similar kind of thing. We get a very unique signature that distinguishes what I'm talking about now from everything else that you've heard. And it works like this. So let's replace Gordon Ramsay with me. This is me in a crumpled shirt. We'll replace the parsley with some speech that seems to be miraculously coming from my belly button. And when we hear this speech, that activates semantic representations of my father and a Cossack hat. And those representations occur in the context of the environment that I might be in. Ordinarily, it would be a conference hall, but now, of course, it's my spare bedroom. And so we associate the speech with these other elements in the environment, and we associate those representations with those other elements in the environment. So it's very similar to the process of relational binding. It's the exact same process, in fact, as when we directly apprehend an event. So a token is simply a unique trajectory, a unique flight path through state space across time. So just to summarize this a little bit here, object tokens are trajectories through space, as I've just said. They're associated with their past through relational binding across time. And this means that object tokens carry their history with them. They are an entire trajectory. They aren't just a point in time, they're a trajectory through time. And this means that activating a token should reactivate its multiple associated states from the past. And that's what we're going to turn to next when we look at the empirical studies that we've done to explore this. Okay, so I'm just going to take a little pause there and see if anyone wants to ask any questions at this point, rather than forcing you to sit through the whole talk and store up your questions and get frustrated because you didn't understand something or you thought something was stupid. And so I just thought I'd break the monotony of a 45-minute talk by making myself available now part way through. So if anyone has a question, please unmute, or as I say to my students, by the way, feel free to post the question in the chat if you are more comfortable doing that.
I have a question. So are there any limits on how far back in history you can get there? Because it would be exponential, right? So you have your memory of association with the preceding event, but it goes down infinitely. Are there any boundaries?
You know, that's such a difficult question to answer, because that's really a question about human memory. And so I expect that, you know, this can go back as far as our human memory allows it. Mm-hmm. I think there's an issue, and I sort of partly touch on it later on when I talk about some of the computational work, although not quite in the context that you're asking it. But there's an issue as to how long do I keep stuff around for before the associations that we form start to fade and degrade. And one way of thinking about it is that, you know, if an association is not useful, if it doesn't inform what may happen next and continues to not inform that, then gradually I would expect that to fade, and we would lose that episodic association. More than that, I'm not really sure I can say.
Can I ask a quick question as well, Gerry, please?
Oh.
I guess this is kind of both a language and thought and sort of bilingualism question rolled into one. To what extent might this be language dependent? And then if you can sort of apply that then to the multilingual mind, would it matter in which language these events happen?
Oddly, I just partly addressed this in a very, very final comment at the very end of the talk. So it is something that I've thought about. So for Zach and I, it's very important to come up with a mechanism that we felt would essentially be the same regardless of whether you're directly apprehending an event or you're hearing about it through language. But there is a key difference between those two. And that is that when we're directly apprehending the event, we can observe that dynamic directly. We can't do that with language. And so the language has to essentially allow us to reinstantiate the dynamic. It has to reinstantiate some of the participants who we may normally see in an event, but they're not mentioned explicitly in the language, like, for example, a knife when cutting. And the language also has to direct our attention to the relevant participants in the event. And those functions of language may manifest differently depending on the language that you speak. And so in that sense, I could imagine that different languages would instantiate these things in different ways, but they could also actually instantiate them in ways that some languages may not. So just to give one example, in Italian, you have the passato remoto, which is a particular tense that doesn't exist in English. And so there's a way of conveying a dynamic in Italian that we can't convey in English. So I think that there are language-specific factors at play, but at the end of the day, I think broadly speaking, one would hope that regardless of language, it's essentially the same kind of event representation qualitatively that one is activating.
I have a
I'm partly
question.
expecting Janina to step in and say something, but.
Grace, you had a question?
Yeah, I have a question that kind of goes off of what Edith asked, and that is, how does event representation change with age? And do you tend to recall the more recent associations that you have?
Yes, that's a really great question. So let me deal with the second one first, because recency is real. And so that's why I have to deal with the second one first. I think there's a real bias in language for recency. It's less clear what the bias is when we're just walking around the world and observing it. And in fact, I'm trying to get a project underway that tries to use the two together. And the reason being that in the modeling work, I don't mention this, we find that there's a huge recency advantage. So the poor networks that we have, they really want to output whatever the most recent representation is that they've encountered or has been activated. And this in part is because of the way the networks work. It's their architecture. It leads to a natural bias with the most recent stuff being the most salient, the most activated. And in part, it's a bias that is perpetuated by our experience of language. So we will introduce a new participant and then we will keep talking about it. So there's a kind of recency bias that's inherent to the language. The question then is whether that is countered such that we can counter the bias through our experience of the real world. So when I'm walking through the real world, for example, when I go up to the mailbox and then walk back again, something that at one point was most recent now becomes the most distant. So in the real world, we're moving between things. Our attention is shifting from one thing and then back again and then back again. And so we don't have that same kind of sticking on the same representation that we tend to have in language. At least that's a conjecture. So, so we think that that's another way in which apprehending events in the real world is a little bit different from doing it in the language. Going to the first point about aging, I think there's a real issue as to how all of this interacts with cognitive control. So the kind of relational binding that I was talking about is it is subject to saliency, to selective attention, to the typical parameters that we think of that cognitive control is all about controlling. So I think there is an issue as to what happens in aging and how events are encoded. Jeff Zaks has actually done some work on that, looking at event segmentation. So people are looking at aging and event, how people encode the structure of events as distinct from the content of events. So I'm more concerned with content than, for example, where do we segment an event, for example. But I think that's a real live issue and people are looking at it, but I can't really tell you very much more. Okay, I'm going to bring up the next part of the talk. So we'll turn to behavior now. And before we do that, though, it's worth reminding ourselves of just one, one observation, which is that really representations of, at a minimum, initial and resultant states of an object need to be simultaneously active to comprehend an event. For example, if all we did was represent in our minds a running commentary of the onion, such that we just represented the onion in its current state at the current moment of thought, we wouldn't know that the onion had been in a prior state. We wouldn't know that an event had happened. We wouldn't know that the onion had changed state. So a priori, representations of initial and resultant states of an object need to be simultaneously active to even comprehend an event. In a sense, we don't need to do experiments to test this. But nonetheless, it's a challenge to do that. So that's what, as an experimental psychologist, I do. So how we test for this coactivation? Well, multiple object states means that there's an ambiguity. That is, that there are multiple representations available, and I have to choose from between them. Okay, so I'm going to just describe two sets of studies. The first study was conducted by Janina Pristauker as part of her doctoral work. And what she did was she gave people sentences such as, "The clown will choose the shiny balloon." There's not very much going on here. She presented this online using Prolific and Gorilla software. And participants would read such a sentence, and then they would see a picture and have to say whether the object in the picture had been mentioned in the sentence. So it's a sentence picture verification task. And Janina collected the reaction times to respond yes. So this is what the data look like. Although I mentioned that she collected reaction times, I'm going to actually show you the proportion of yes responses. The reaction times mirror these data exactly. And all the differences that you will see are highly significant statistically. So when she gives people "the clown will choose the shiny balloon," on around 87–88% of occasions, participants will say, yes, that object had been mentioned in the sentence. Now notice that it's a deflated balloon, and Janina had done extensive norming to show that the typical representation of a balloon is in fact of an inflated balloon, not a deflated one. It turns out this is actually quite important, and I can come back to that if anybody wants to ask me. So this is going to be a kind of baseline that we're going to use, and now we're going to ask, well, what happens when people read "the clown will inflate the shiny balloon" and they see the same deflated balloon? This is the atypical case. It is not the canonical representation of a balloon that people have when they think of a balloon. But remember that the theory here is that when I comprehend this sentence and I represent the event that it describes, I will create representations of the balloon both in its initial state and in its end state. And so in that case, the representation of the initial deflated state should be more accessible. And what we find is exactly that. We find a significantly greater proportion of yes responses to that deflated balloon relative to the case when participants read "the clown will choose the shiny balloon." Now, the reaction times were the exact converse. They were faster to say yes to the deflated balloon after "the clown will inflate the shiny balloon" than after "the clown will choose the shiny balloon." Now, just as an aside, Janina also included sentences such as "the clown will choose the inflated balloon." And we have the idea here that the morphosyntax of inflated as a prenominal participle is focusing attention on the end state and is essentially an instruction to the system to suppress or block the activation of the initial state of the balloon. And in fact, we see a very considerable suppression effect here in the proportion of yes responses. Okay, so I mentioned that representations of initial and resultant states of an object need to be simultaneously active to comprehend an event. And I'm going to turn now to a different way of establishing the same thing, this time using fMRI. Again, when testing coactivation, we can use the fact that if you represent multiple object states, you have an ambiguity. But now we're going to take account of the fact that ambiguity is often accompanied by conflict. And we're going to use this in a series of fMRI studies to show that multiple object states are accessible and available to the listener or hearer. So how do we do this? Well, our strategy is to find which bits in the brain respond to Stroop conflict. The Stroop task is where you have a word such as yellow, but printed in the color brown. And people have to respond to the color it's printed in rather than to the color that the word names. So if the word yellow is printed in brown, they have to press the brown key in the scanner. So we find which bits in the brain respond to Stroop conflict because we know that these bits light up to other kinds of conflict also. We see, for example, that they light up to syntactic ambiguity and the conflict that that creates. We're going to have people lie in the scanner and read pairs of sentences such as these. The chef will chop the onion, then she will weigh the onion. Or, the chef will smell the onion, then she will weigh the onion. Now, critically, the onion that is weighed in the first pair of sentences is a chopped onion. But again, because of norming, we know that when someone smells an onion, they activate a generic representation of onion, which is an intact onion. So we know that in the second sentence, when you hear, or read rather, then she'll weigh the onion, that the onion being weighed is probably an intact onion. So in the case of chop the onion, we have these distinct representations. The initial state is intact, and the chopped state, and the state that is weighed is chopped. We don't have that those two different states in the case of smelling an onion and weighing an onion. So we're looking for those bits in the brain that respond to Stroop conflict. We have people read these sentences, and then we see if these bits of the brain that respond to Stroop, and only these bits, are sensitive to chopping the onion versus smelling the onion. That is, do we see evidence of conflict when we've read chop the onion compared to when we've read smell the onion? If we do, that implies multiple simultaneous representations of object state. Well, to cut the longer story short, yes, Stroop sensitive voxels in posterior ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, that's essentially LIFG, which, for those of you that aren't neuroscientists, encompasses the region of the brain that has Broca's area, that really all-important language area. So Stroop sensitive voxels in this part of the brain were sensitive to the difference between smell and chop. That is, they were sensitive to object state change. In fact, the bold response, the thing we're measuring in the scanner, correlated with separate ratings provided by separate participants of the degree of change that the objects underwent as a result of the event that was described in that first sentence. So when you chop the onion undergoes more change than when you weigh the onion or smell the onion. Now, we actually did something else. We contrasted the chef will chop the onion, then she'll weigh the onion, with the chef will chop the onion, then she'll weigh another onion. All we've done is change whether it's the same onion or a different onion. We should see representational conflict in the first case, where the weighed onion is, when we activate a representation of onion at that point, we should have available the history of that onion, and that history has both the unchopped and the chopped states, and there'll be some conflict. We have to decide which one we want to choose for the weighing. But in the case of the chef will chop the onion, then she'll weigh another onion. In this case, we instantiate a new onion from semantic memory, a new generic onion, which will not be in that chopped state. So when we weigh another onion, there is no conflict. There is only one state, we presume. So what did we find? Well, we found that effect in posterior ventrolateral prefrontal cortex in the first case. But in the case of another onion, we found no effect. So it appears that to observe this competition, we need to bind into the same token. It has to be the same token that we activate at way as had been introduced in the first sentence. These are actually the data across 4 different studies. The brain on the bottom right is actually due to work of my student Zach Ekvies. The brain in the bottom left, work of my student Janina Pristalka. And all the other figures are from my collaboration with Sharon Thompson-Schill, Nick Hindi, and Sarah Solomon. We see far too many of those pictures in the talks and the papers that we read, so I'm not going to go into those in any detail. All I'm going to do is conclude that conflict suggests multiple simultaneous representations of object state. That is, multiple distinct states of the same object are represented when we process these kinds of event descriptions. Okay, so in just a moment, we'll move to computation. And here I am again, inviting questions to this part of the talk. I realize there's something quite strange, by the way, about doing this, because it's exactly the inverse of what normally happens. Normally, people would go for a little coffee break when there's this kind of break. But when we're on Zoom, they're actually making coffee during the speaking, and then they try and be here when it's live. But anyway, any questions?
Yeah, Gerry, actually, I've never asked you this, but regarding the fMRI data across all these studies, have you noticed any at all activation in the visual cortex at all?
Yeah, thank you. We do. So in the studies with Sarah Solomon and Nick Hindi, so across 1, 2, 3 reading studies in the scanner, we found that there were differences in visual cortex that also correlated with those degree of change ratings that I mentioned earlier. And the activation in the visual cortex predicted activation in posterior ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. So the idea there is that we are possibly representing the state of the objects in those parts of the cerebral cortex that are involved in perception and action and so on. And so in this case, we have a representation of the visual change in visual cortex, and that PDL-PFC or LFG or whatever it is controlling, selecting from amongst those representations laid down in those cortices.
Thank you, Gerry.
Hi, Dr. Altmann. I have one quick question.
Sorry, yes.
The example sentences you gave in the slides are kind of like they are all action verbs in those verbs. So I've been thinking, if it is a linking verb, for example, this is an ani, how to understand the initial state and the resultative state from your framework?
Sorry, could you just give me the example again?
For example, this is an ani. This is an ani. So here the verb is linking verb is, instead of those action verbs you use like chop and something like that. So
right.
How to understand the initial state and the resultant state from your framework?
So it depends on the context in which you put this. So in all of our studies, we've actually presumed, I didn't go into this in any detail, that we're using that initial sentence to set up some event dynamic. And then in the second sentence, what we're doing is we're now retrieving a representation of the object that was mentioned earlier. And it is at that point that we have this conflict. That is, which representation should I select from? So I could imagine that when I say, John chopped an onion, and then I say, you know, here is that onion, or so I now put the listener or reader in a context where they don't really need to resolve the conflict. Okay, I'm just saying, you know, here's the onion. I could imagine that one would see these effects go away. I mean, I think it's actually an interesting question. It's not one that I've thought about before, but I think that would be a really interesting test. So when I say he'll weigh the onion, it matters the form that the onion is in, because if it's an intact onion, you can pick it up in one hand and put it on the scales. If it's chopped, it has different affordances. But if I refer to the onion with a verb that is not an action verb, then I agree. I think I would see a different effect. I think that's a really nice point. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, while anyone's thinking of anything else, I'm going to queue up the final section. So we're now on that final straight slope that the skier crashes down at the end of the slalom. I'll start this section on computational modeling by explaining why we chose recurrent networks for this work. I've mentioned earlier that events unfold across time. They are not like photographs that are just a single moment or depict just a single moment. Rather, they are a succession of moments, and at each one of these moments, there is a trace or an echo of the previous moment. So I've tried to illustrate that with this cartoon. Now, events are all about things that need to be tracked over time. And to track something over time, you need that trace, you need that memory of prior time. And recurrent neural networks are particularly good at encoding that kind of memory. That's what they're for. So recurrent neural networks encode their inputs as trajectories through time, exactly the kind of encoding that I mentioned at the beginning when talking about the theory that underpins our work. Now, I don't expect you to know anything about how recurrent neural networks work. Many of you will do, but for the remainder of this section, you don't need to know. You just need to know that they are particularly good at encoding variation across time. So let me tell you, before I tell you what we did, let me tell you about the models that we used, the computational models. These were recurrent neural networks with LSTMs. These are long, short-term memories. They simply keep those echoes alive as long as they're needed. Each network had a vocabulary of 50,000 items, and we trained two sets of networks. One set were trained on Wikipedia, a subset of Wikipedia with roughly 103 million words. Another set of networks were trained on 100 million words from elsewhere on the web, excluding Wikipedia. In fact, they were taken from Reddit entries and the links out onto the internet from Reddit, but again, excluding Wikipedia. Now, for each set of networks, whether Wikipedia or the web, we had 25 different networks, each with a different random weight initialization. So we're going to treat each network a little bit like an individual participant who has very slightly different experience. And the task of the networks was to go through each corpus and take in one word and predict what the next word would be. So this is the standard prediction task that Gerry Altmann introduced to us all. Okay, so I'm going to describe two things that we did, just as an example of the work we do. And one of them was encoding degree of change. I'd mentioned earlier on that when we put people in the scanner, they can read sentences like the chef will chop the onion or the chef will peel the onion. And human participants will rate the change that the onion undergoes in the chef will chop the onion as greater than the change that the onion undergoes in the chef will peel the onion. And these ratings correlate with the bold response. So the rating they give for a sentence with a verb like chop will be higher than the rating that they give for a sentence with a verb like peel. The question that we wanted to know is whether our networks would provide equivalent information, even though, of course, they weren't trained to do this. They were just trained on that prediction task. So could a recurrent neural network know that peeling the onion isn't as big a change as chopping the onion? So how do we do this? So let me just start with a kind of graphical portrayal of what we do. So let's suppose that we have some representation of an onion, and then something happens to that onion and we get a new representation. Let's say it's chopped onion. We can compare those two representations and ask what is the difference between them. We might count the difference in the pixels, or we might look at the activation pattern in the neural network. Similarly, we might have an onion, but now we have a peeled onion that we are comparing against this. And again, we can ask what is the difference, what is the delta between these two representations. And these representations may be, again, a pattern of activation across the network. In fact, when we look at the networks, what we're doing is we're looking at the patterns of activation across the hidden layers. Our networks had two hidden layers. We were looking at the topmost of those hidden layers. So what do we actually do? Well, we are going to give the networks these sentences to read, and instead of showing them onions, what we do is we ask, what is the representation we get if we simply give the network the phrase an onion? And we're going to look at that representation. It's a pattern of activation across that hidden layer. Actually, it's a very, very large vector. And we're going to compare that pattern of activation to the one that we get at the offset of the sentence. So after the chef will chop the onion, if the network knows about what happens to onions when you chop them or when you peel them, the difference in the representation that we get at the end of the sentence compared to that first representation that's due to an onion, that difference should be greater for the chop sentence than for the peel sentence, because the representation of an onion after it's been chopped should be more different from a generic onion than the representation we get after the onion has been peeled, again compared to that generic onion. So we had a number of sentence pairs. I've put the information at the bottom of the slide here, and in fact we found that the network estimates calculated this way, comparing these two activation patterns. In fact, we use simply Pearson's R to compare the two vectors. The metric we get from the network correlates with the human estimates. It's not a huge effect, it's a correlation of 0.2, but it's significant. And it didn't matter whether we used the 25 networks trained on Wikipedia or the 25 networks trained elsewhere on the web. So the bigger the difference for the networks, the bigger the difference for the humans. Of course, 0.2 is a very small correlation. We're only accounting for a very small proportion of the variance. But it's worth remembering that the networks only have experience of the language, whereas the human participants, when judging the degree of change that an object undergoes, can use not just their experience of a language, but their experience of the world as they have directly viewed it. So it's not surprising that the proportion of variance that we can explain through the model is so low. Okay, and now I want to move to a second thing that we did, but using the same sort of technique, but to ask a more, in some sense, novel question. I'm going to change the example to ask how are representations maintained as sentences unfold. So we're going to move away from onions, I'm afraid, and we're going to talk about farmers. The farmer will shear the sheep, then he will feed the sheep. Just to help you, here is our farmer. There is a reason for this graphic, as you'll see in just a moment. So what we're interested in here is how does the network propagate forwards the representation of the agent of the events, the shearing event and the feeding event, how does the representation of the farmer propagate through the first sentence and into the second and possibly beyond? So we need it to propagate forward because we need to establish the dependency between the sheep and the farmer. They engaged in that event. It is their histories that intersects. And then, of course, at he, we need to pick out from the mess of representation that is activated within that hidden space. We need to retrieve the representation of the farmer. And then again, there is dependency between the farmer and the sheep at the end of the second sentence over here. So how are we going to look at this propagation of the agent of the event? Well, we're going to do something very similar to what we did before. We're going to look at what is the internal representation after simply reading the farmer. And then at each subsequent point in the sentence, we're going to compare the activation pattern at that hidden layer at that point to the activation pattern we had got simply after the farmer. And we can do this at each point in the sentence. Now, what we actually did is we added a third sentence. So we had the farmer will shear the sheep, then he will feed the sheep, then he will think about the sheep. We just wanted to really stretch the networks to see what they could do. And what I'm going to plot in this graph is the similarity in the representation at each moment in the sentence, at each point in the sentence, relative to the farmer, the activation pattern we get just in response to that noun phrase. And it should go up and down. And that's what we see. There are some notable things here. So, for example, we have these two high peaks at he. That looks very good. We would like that. And we have some slightly lower peaks at each of the mentions of the sheep. And remember, there is that dependency between the farmer and the sheep in each of the sentences. Now, this all looks very good, but we can't be sure that these patterns really reflect what we think they might reflect. But in some sense, that doesn't matter, because what I want to do is address a very, very slightly different issue, which is not why do we get these patterns in the network, but rather what patterns would we observe if we did the exact same thing, but in a scanner or an MEG or a high-density EEG system, asking the same question about how do representations propagate through these sentences. We don't know the answer to that. To our knowledge, no one has asked that question. And it may actually be a really important question to know the answer to, because there are some, we have some predictions that we might make about when we may expect to see peaks and when we may not. So there are really two questions. One of them is, do we see or can we see this kind of waxing and waning if we do a representational similarity analysis in the way that we've done here, but with humans? And then the other question is whether the pattern of waxing and waning that we see in the networks might predict the waxing and waning that we see in the human case. Given what we know about semantic memory, we certainly expect some of the network's patterns to replicate in the human case. Now, we haven't done this work yet, but I'm presenting this here really as a way of showing how there can be a very strong relationship between computational modeling on the one hand and exploring equivalent questions, but empirically, neuroscientifically in the human brain. There's a kind of synergy between those two fields. There's a challenge that I want to introduce now as we come towards the end of this section on computational modeling that I think nonetheless is rather important, and it does complicate things. So we wanted to know whether recurrent neural networks encode discourse entities or discourse objects as trajectories through time. it does seem that representations are propagated forwards through and between sentences. Now, I put representations in scare quotes because we can think of representations within a dynamical system as really just constraints on where that dynamical system can move next. Okay. As these representations propagate, they change to reflect the events described by each sentence. We saw that with the chop the onion case. And as they propagate, they wax and wane as a function of the past, present, and future input, the input that we're predicting. Turns out they also wax and wane as a function of the impact that these inputs have on the system. So although I didn't talk about it here, we find that certain things will perturb the system more than other things that will perturb it less, and that has an impact on the waxing and waning. But the question is, are these networks propagating representations of tokens, individuated entities that have continuity across time? Well, we're actually no more able to determine the answer for networks than we are to determine it for humans. We assume that we encode objects as tokens. Here is my iPhone, and you are now encoding this as an object. I take it away, I bring it back. The question is this: are you encoding this now as the same object with a commitment that the two things are the same? Or is it simply the case that when you see it again, it is the most similar thing to your memory of that other thing that you had just seen a moment before I had moved it away? It could be that you encode these two things as being highly similar without a commitment to them actually being the same. We don't have an empirical method yet for distinguishing those two cases. In one case, there's an identity relationship encoded. In the other case, there isn't. It's just a similarity relationship. So we can't tell whether people are encoding tokens. We have an intuition that they are, but as you know, as psychologists, we cannot simply go by intuition. So we don't want to hold the network to a higher standard than we hold people to, and vice versa. Okay, so just to summarize the computational section, computational models offer insights into, in fact, the gaps in our knowledge. For example, we can't measure tokens in the human brain, just as we can't in artificial ones. It's tempting to think that because we have access to that pattern of activation, that we can make sense of it. It turns out we can't, except by doing behavioral studies, that is, asking what is the behavior of the network. There are some ways of doing that, using clustering techniques and so on, but still, at the end of the day, you have to ground the clustering in behavior. Computational models also offer insights into new ways to interrogate the human mind and explore properties of its representational content. So that was the idea of looking at that waxing and waning of representations as they propagate through the sentence. Okay. To summarize the whole talk, and if there really is only one slide that you take away with you, this should be the one. So this is really the key issue now. And really it's simply this, that events are simply cases when states change and optionally when trajectories collide. You can have state change when there aren't multiple trajectories. A single object can change by itself. When you have multiple objects, those correspond to events with multiple participants. Event comprehension consists in the encoding, updating, and retrieval of intersecting object histories. That is, trajectories of token states and changes in state that extend from the past into the future. So event representations are simply a part of the dynamical representation of tokens and their trajectories through feature space, physical space, and time. In a sense, event representations and token representations are the same thing. And language comprehension consists in the instantiation of dynamical representations of object histories. So when we observed that video of the chef chopping the onion, we could directly apprehend the event dynamics. But we can't do that when we just use language. So we have to use that language based on experience during the acquisition of the language. We have to use that language to instantiate the dynamics of the event. Okay, so with that, I shall thank you for watching, and I'll be happy to take questions. And I'm back, although with some delay, it seems to be.
I have a question if you're not too delayed to hear me.
I can hear you fine.
Okay, great. So excellent, phenomenal talk. I find this stuff so interesting. I had a question, maybe something you've been thinking about, but your trajectory diagram, I've been thinking about that since the first part of the talk, because I find it a really compelling metaphor. And I wonder if you've thought about applying some of the recent work on neural manifolds to seeing whether representations of tokens, as you say, actually do follow intersecting trajectories in their representational space. So not just looking at like correlations of patterns in networks, but rather tracing out the sort of latent space of object representation in a more meaningful way, where maybe onion and knife sort of intersect at the word chop, but not peel.
So I think that's a wonderful idea. It's something that we're thinking about, but trying to figure out how to do. So there are a few studies that have done something sort of similar. There's a recent study by Lolly Tyler's group in Cambridge, where they've used essentially representational similarity analysis across time with MEG to try and look at one particular aspect of language processing. But a little bit like the case that I gave with the waxing and waning, they were really just looking at, in fact, they were tracking surprisal. Whereas what we want to do is track the representational content. And what we haven't done, and I view this as actually the really important part of your suggestion, is ask, when we have a description of something like the chef chopping the onion, or even if we view it directly and we could scan during that, could we now, well, certainly we could actually do the representational similarity analysis through time with both those representations, the onion and the knife and the chef too. Now, in principle, yes, I guess we could then look to see if we're getting the intersection of those in the neural signature. But to be honest, I just don't know how good the signal to noise would be for that level of detail. I think it's a great idea, and it's certainly something to aspire to and to try. Yeah, absolutely. I'm slightly hesitant in my responses because you're all moving in this sort of funny, jerky way and all out of sync with one another. It's a bit like watching people dance, but you can't hear the music, which, by the way, is the proof that people can't dance well, because they're all out of sync.
Gerry, I have a question. Yeah. So I really do not know much about computation, so the modeling part. So I got interested when you showed the graph with the farmer, sheep, so the peaks were going up and down, right? So pardon maybe if I ask something. So I understand why the peaks go up for he, when it's referring to the farmer. So I was expecting actually to see differential peaks for the sheep in different states. But those peaks are not different, right? Like they kind of stay the same.
Right. So those peaks are essentially capturing the extent to which each word is reactivating the farmer. So regardless of the state that the sheep is in, there is an association between the sheep and the farmer, and you want that to play out. You want that structural dependency in the sentence to manifest as a semantic dependency between these two entities, the agent of the action and the patient.
I understand, because your baseline in that example was the farmer at the beginning.
Exactly. And, Steve's point was exactly, in a sense, well, why didn't I also do the sheep and look at how that changed and look at how the peaks travel together or how they separate? And it's a brilliant idea. I'm absolutely going to do that next. I mean, I can do that in the computational work. Then the question is, can we do it in the neuroimaging work?
Yeah, my thought was way less complex and beautiful than Steve's. So I was more just thinking, can we just look at the sheep and see whether we can see the change? Forget about the farmer, right? Like just tracking the sheep change.
Right. So
because the sheep got picked up and got a haircut and got thought about, right?
Right. So it turns out that we don't really have a handle, even in the computational model, on the content of these representations. All the analysis methods we have are based on similarity. So when you think about representational similarity analysis, it's about similarity. When you think about clustering, it's about similarity. When you look at theories of semantic memory, it's all about similarity. To actually unpack the clustering one gets, to unpack the similarity structure and turn it into content, you have to map it onto behavior. Currently, we don't have a way easily of saying, yeah, the sheep is bald here, just by looking at the activation.
Got it.
Now, of course, Janina would say, well, that's not strictly true, because if it's bald, it will look more like you than it did before the shearing. So yeah, maybe.
Hi, Gerry. I'm going to try to articulate this question, so let me know if it makes sense or not. But I was thinking about when we're very young, or babies in general, at a very young age, they may see their mother in front of them, and as soon as the mom goes behind them, they'll begin to cry because they think the mom has disappeared. And then she comes back into their, frame of vision, and then, oh, she exists again, and they're happy. So is that something like the example you gave with your phone, where we see your phone, you put it away, and it comes back up, but we're still cognizant of the fact that it's probably your phone?
Right. And in fact, so I've got another student, Emily Yearling, who's been doing work with children to find out at what age can we see evidence of an emergent ability to track object histories. Because it turns out when you look at the literature, you can see that people like Sue Carey and her students have done an awful lot of work showing that, and Liz Spelke, showing that infants can individuate objects, they can count them, all sorts of things. But what we don't know is when we do that trick with their mother or an iPhone, whether they make a representational commitment to this being the same thing that I saw before the cloth was put over it, or it's just of the same type. So they might recognize, oh yeah, a ball went under the cloth and a ball comes out of the cloth. And they can distinguish that from a ball went under the cloth and a teddy bear came out of the cloth. But we don't know, and I find this stunning in the literature, we don't know whether they distinguish between a ball going under the cloth and the same ball coming out, or a ball coming out of the cloth and one that just looks the same, and they treat it as just being very similar. It's a very subtle distinction that maybe only lives on in the minds of philosophers, but that question as to whether we are binding those two representations such that the new object inherits the history of the old, well, that's the question one has to ask, and no one has asked that question in that literature. So they've made the assumption that when the baby is surprised when the ball changes shape, they've made the assumption that the baby thought it was the same ball, but no, maybe the baby just thought it was a ball of the same type. And in fact, there's quite a bit of evidence from some of the techniques that some of the Gerry lab and their students have carried out. There's quite a lot of evidence to suggest exactly that what they are doing is they're reacting at the level of types of things rather than reacting to tokens of things.
Thank you.
I have a question. So this is quite like the sheep example, except it's less semantic-y and it's more syntax. How do syntactic dependencies like WH dependencies affect event representation when you like need that cognitive control to integrate at like the gap as the language unfolds?
Right. So I can't really answer that. All I can tell you is, the stock approach to these kinds of structures where what the gap is telling you is what is the role that the filler should inherit, from amongst the roles that the verb is giving out, if you like. So one of the things that we've noticed with the recurrent networks that we've been using is there are certain structural phenomena that they can correctly anticipate how the sentence will unfold. Now, I know that people have done gap filling with recurrent nets. We haven't actually tested that directly with these particular ones. We've got no reason to suppose that anything different will happen. I think that, yeah, I don't know. I can't answer. We haven't actually looked at what happens in those cases. So, for example, what if we give, never mind a WH filler, what if we just have a relative clause where we have a gap site? Will we see reactivation in that profile of the waxing and the waning? So we haven't actually tested that, and that's a very good idea.
Thank you.